Thank you, Sam, and hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about somewhat grisly. Sam had said it was bodies and horror, and I thought, oh, I have many of those to share with you at the moment. So, my name's Hannah Priest. I'm currently writing a book about the Manchester Mummy. Now, the Manchester Mummy is going to make sort of cameos in this talk, so I will tell you a little. If you're unfamiliar with the story of the Manchester Mummy, it will be coming up in the talk, so I will kind of fill you in on Manchester Mummy 101 stuff. Um, as Sam said, when we first started arriving, this is going to be a little bit of a Manchester-centric talk in some ways, but you don't need to know Manchester. I guess the only thing you need to know about Manchester is it's not London, it's not the capital, and so I will be using the term provincial on occasions to mean a place outside the capital. Other aspects of Manchester's history and character will become apparent as the talk goes on. So my talk today is on body snatching, the city, and the return of the repressed. However, its main title is The Ghastly Find at Cheetham, or A Ghastly Find at Cheetham. So I'm going to start with a story that I think hopefully will set the tone for what I'm going to be talking about today. And so I need to kind of take us back to a crumbling old mansion house in a place called Cheatwood. Now, Cheatwood, before the Industrial Revolution, is best understood as a tiny hamlet at the edge of a small village at the edge of a wannabe town. In the 19th century, it could be understood as a tiny part of a suburb of a city. And I'll be talking through a little bit about, it's the same place, by the way, it didn't move. The difference that in that location of Cheatwood. But if you picture it as a former hamlet on the edge of a slightly bigger village, so Cheetham is the village, and Cheatwood is essentially an estate within Cheetham, and it's on the southernmost side, so it's the bit that is closest to the town of Manchester, which is bigger place. Cheatwood, until the Industrial Revolution, was essentially this manor house, which was owned on land, and the house itself was owned by the Earl of Derby, and it was held in leasehold by members of the gentry. Surrounded by fields, as you can imagine, probably a little bit of tenant farming going on. Elsewhere in Cheetham, there were like about 5 cottages and something that called itself a priory, but I suspect was just a chapel that had once belonged to the mansion house, and a couple of other buildings. It got a little bit more built up as it went into the 19th century. But our story begins with Cheatwood Hall. So Cheatwood Hall had existed since the Tudor period. It was post-medieval manor house. It was described as picturesque, gabled, your fair leaded windows, your fairly standard Tudor mansion house. A story that appeared just before it was knocked down suggested it dated right back to the time of Henry VIII. But I think in a lot of places in this part of what is now Manchester, we just generally call them Tudor because they appeared, or early modern, to be honest, because they appeared between the end of the 16th and the end of the 17th century, these houses. And there was a couple of others nearby elsewhere, so in Smedley and elsewhere in Cheetham as well. So we're not going to go at the beginning of the story of Cheatwood Hall. We're going to come in at the end of Cheatwood Hall, because Cheatwood Hall was knocked down in July 1890, and that's when the ghastly find occurred. So I'm going to tell you what happened. I'm going to tell you through the words of a newspaper story from the Middleton Guardian on the 5th of July 1890. Now, there were a lot of newspaper stories about the ghastly find. I'm using the Middleton Guardian one because on the 5th of July, it was actually a weekend, they published this huge article that kind of condensed and summarized all of the other coverage that had happened. So it's a really good go-to article, covers so much about this. But I'm going to read you what the Middleton Guardian said about Cheatwood Hall. Two labourers named John Fogg and John Clark, who were employed at a brickworks off Derby Street, Cheetham, made a dreadful discovery while following their employment on Tuesday morning. The works are situated in the middle of a plot of vacant land, which is bounded on one side by Derby Street and on another side by the high wall, which runs along the rear of Strangeways Prison. In the course of the operations at the brickworks, it was found necessary, in order to maintain the supply of clay, to pull down Cheatwood Hall, an ancient building which at one time was a picturesque landscape. The old structure with its latticed windows and timber supports was, as we have stated, demolished so that its site might yield material for the brickmakers. Clay getting went on uneventfully until Tuesday morning, when the two workmen made a discovery of a startling character. While digging away at a depth of 4 or 5 feet from what was once the ground floor of the old hall, they met with an obstruction. It turned out to be a wooden coffin of medium length. With some difficulty, they succeeded in recovering it from the clay in which it was firmly embedded, and proceeding further in their investigations, they opened the shell to find inside an oblong leaden box. On the box being opened, it was seen to contain what are believed to be human remains, although as yet no definite opinion can be expressed upon the point. The appearance they presented is described as tinned salmon, and one strange and unaccountable circumstance is that no bones were seen. It should be stated, however, that only a cursory examination was made, one probable reason for which is that the stench issued from the box when it was opened was almost overpowering. Although the coffin was of medium size, the leaden box in which the supposed remains were found is not more than 4 feet in length, and its shape does not bear any resemblance to the cases which are usually prepared for the reception of human remains. So this is a description of what happened that day when the workers at the brickworks dug up this coffin, which is a wooden coffin with a lead box inside it with human remains, no bones, looking like tinned salmon, and with an overpowering stench. I love this story. I think it is just the stuff of urban Gothic. This is it predates Dracula, the publication of Dracula, a little bit, but we're in that territory. I'm sorry, Sam, I promised no tangents, but just to say, Cheetham is actually next to the Salford district of Broughton, where the Victoria Theatre was indeed opened by Bram Stoker. But that's just a coincidence. I just thought it was worth pointing that out. Because that's the territory that we feel like we're in with this story. Now, what happened after the first reports, so the Middleton Guardian report is summarising these, is a whole load of theories, a whole load of suggestions of what this terrifying find might be. All of the newspaper stories had headlines like terrifying find at Cheetham, startling discovery at Cheatwood, ghastly find, ghastly discovery, sinister discovery, and a number of theories were put forward. However, they quite quickly coalesced around the hall's former occupant. And this is how the Middleton Guardian summarised it. The house was formerly occupied by a Dr. White, who lived there for many years in the old body-snatching days, when considerable difficulty was experienced in securing bodies for dissection. From the appearance of the contents of the coffin and the absence of skull or bones, Superintendent Godby of Sea Police's B Division has come to the conclusion that they are portions of bodies which have been taken to a doctor's house for the purpose of dissection. Superintendent Godby there is responding to a particular question, as becomes apparent from, he didn't just pop into it saying, oh yeah, body snatching. He was asked if it could be a recent murder, if he was looking at a murder victim. So what he's saying is, it is much more likely that they are portions of bodies that have been taken for the purposes of dissection. Superintendent Godby is a cautious chap, and he was just trying to ward off suggestions. It is 1890, after all, that there's some sort of Ripper character around Cheatwood. Didn't stop people speculating on that. Now, the Middleton Guardian and a lot of the other articles were very, very quick to point out this first sentence: the house was formerly occupied by a Dr. White. And some people remembered Dr. White, remembered the name. His grandson had lived there for quite a time as well, that sort of kept the Whites' association with Cheatwood Hall quite fresh in the memory. Charles White himself actually hadn't lived there, he inherited it, but it was remembered that he had lived there because his heirs went on to live there. And people remembered things about Charles White. In particular, they remembered his most notorious act, which was to create the Manchester mummy. So the Manchester mummy was the body of a woman called Hannah Beswick, who died in the 1750s and was mummified by Charles White and put on display. Her body was put on display. This is what my book's about, so I'm giving you a very brief introduction to the Manchester mummy. There is a Wikipedia page for the Manchester mummy, and I'm delighted to say that when you read my book, you will discover that the Wikipedia page is almost entirely wrong. There's a lot of misconceptions about Hannah Beswick, but it is one of those stories. It's part ghost story, part urban legend, part history of museums, because the body ended up in the Natural History Museum in Manchester, which was the precursor to the Manchester Museum, which is a museum owned by the University of Manchester. So when this coffin was, this grisly, ghastly, frightening, terrifying, whatever you want to call it, find, was discovered at Cheatwood Hall and the association was made with Dr. White, people were quite quick to think, well, this is something connected to the Manchester mummy. It can't be the body of Hannah Beswick, of course, because that was displayed for 110 years after her death, before eventually being buried in 1868. And that was a known fact in 1890. So it can't be the Manchester mummy, because the Manchester mummy is residing in Harper Hay Cemetery on the other side of North Manchester. So what could it be? We've already seen what Superintendent Godby suggested, body snatching. Other people suggested other things. So the article on the 5th of July ended with, whose remains are those now unearthed? And why were they so disposed of? Is it possible that the coffin contains the corpse of the said Miss Beswick, and that the reputed mummy was simply a make-up and make-believe for some reason or other? It is notorious that Miss Beswick's mother, Patience, whose husband John died in 1705, disappeared. No one knows how, and it is suggested that she may have met with foul play, and that the remains now found may be hers. Now, these articles provoked a flurry of people writing into newspapers, both local and a couple of national stories as well, with their suggestions, their theories, and also their trying to add facts to it. One of my favourites is someone wrote in and said, well, it's very well known that Patience, who was Patience Buckley, Hannah Beswick's mother, she married a butcher from Ashton-under-Lyne and was murdered by him. I love that story because almost everything there is fiction, completely, and I can prove it. But it feels like in 1890, the idea, I don't know, that image of the butcher from Ashton-under-Lyne may well have been influenced by popular culture and other notorious newspaper stories at the time, rather than what actually happened. So people were writing in with stories like that. There was a lot of very urban legendy ways of writing in, going, oh yes, Miss Beswick was a kinswoman of my mother. Miss Beswick knew my grandfather. You know, Miss Beswick was a friend of a friend, so I can tell you. Other people went so far as to suggest Dr. White himself was a murderer. It's a bit extreme. But I want to go back to Superintendent Godby's assertion, which was that Charles White lived there in the old body snatching days. And I want to talk a little bit about what the old body snatching days were, because I think that is something that is a really, really evocative phrase. But for a lot of us, we might not have any particular concrete understanding of what the old body snatching days mean and how it might be relevant to an old Tudor house in a hamlet in a village on the edge of a wannabe town. So, what is body snatching? So for a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, obviously, it may well be people here tonight who are a bit more versed in this field. But I think in the popular imagination, you say body snatching and people go straight to Burke and Hare. And I think it's a hill a lot of people want to die on, to say the Burke and Hare weren't body snatchers. They were murderers. That's what they were tried for. So I kind of want to move beyond Burke and Hare a little bit, but also to contextualize what Burke and Hare were doing. They were a kind of anomalous, abhorrent anomaly that captured the popular imagination. However, they were part of a kind of spectrum of body snatching, if we can call it that, that was characterized the sort of Georgian period. Not the entire Georgian period, but it was there at the back of an awful lot of stuff. There are different types of body snatching. Body snatching can mean different things. Ultimately, the term is used as almost like a catch-all phrase for preventing the burial of a body and removing it usually into the possession of an anatomist for dissection. Now, bodies can be snatched from the point of death. So these can be bodies that at the point of death, instead of being removed to burial, or handed to the family to provide a funeral, are passed for dissection instead. So this can happen to, for example, executed criminals, where the body leaves the gibbet and goes to the anatomist. It can mean people who have died in certain institutions, prisons, workhouses, poorhouses, asylums, where when they die, if there's no family to claim the body, or sometimes if there is family to claim the body body is passed to anatomists instead. However, body snatching also covers what we might actually term as grave robbing, which is where a burial has taken place, but the body is removed, or is supposed to be taking place, and the body is removed from the grave after burial or intercepted on the way to burial. And these are the sort of really notorious cases. And the term resurrection men is used to refer to the men who were employed, usually by anatomists, to essentially dig up bodies, to intercept funerals, and so on. So when a burial was supposed to be going ahead, to stop it going ahead. So resurrection men, on the whole, were more of the grave robbing type of body snatching, but body snatching could also refer to the very legal process of a beadle removing a body after an execution and taking it to an anatomist. So the men who were at the heart of body snatching were the anatomists themselves. Now, on one side, and I never know which way around it's going to show for you, the guy who's standing up with his arm outstretched is Robert Knox. So a doctor and a surgeon and anatomist in Edinburgh, who is forever associated with Burke and Hare, because they were among the people in his employ, supplying him with cadavers. I say among. Burke and Hare were not the only people supplying Robert Knox with cadavers. On the other side of the screen, the very pensive looking man is one of the most prolific dissectionists and body snatchers, really, of Georgian London. It's John Hunter of the Hunterian Museum fame. John Hunter carried out a huge number of dissections, both public and private. And the Hunterian Museum collection is made up of specimens from his dissections, some of which were quite notorious. So John Hunter is the man who intercepted the funeral of Charles Byrne, also known as the Irish Giant. Hunter had been trying to get Blackburn to agree to give him his body when he died, and he intercepted the funeral and took the body, supposedly leaving the grieving friends with a coffin full of rocks. He then prepared the skeleton, which is still held in the Hunterian Museum, and there were serious ethical questions being asked around that. The story of the Irish giant has been the focus of a couple of novels and some other popular explanations about it as well. But Hunter also was very arrogant and boastful about how much dissection he could do and how many bodies he could get. And some of his diaries and letters just openly admit to having taken bodies from the grave. So there is one of his notebooks that simply says he went to a graveyard and dug up, I think it's a fine, sturdy man for the muscles. Absolutely no shame there. So I want to talk a little bit about why they were doing this. These weren't kind of Victor Frankenstein type doctors, but actually at the cutting edge of some scientific discoveries. John Hunter's brother, William Hunter, was certainly really cutting edge. For example, discoveries about the circulatory system. So what were they doing? I think we've all probably got an image of what these Georgian doctors were doing. We've got an image of them dissecting a corpse in a Gothic-looking lecture theatre while people looked on ghoulishly. But they were using these bodies for teaching purposes. They were obviously, in order to study anatomy, you have to have some sort of practical demonstration of the human body. What better way than to dissect a human body? And, you know, you couldn't just give everyone a cadaver. It didn't work like that. So you would dissect a body in front of the audience and it would be for teaching purposes. Now, in order to get back to Cheatwood, I need to say a little bit about what was happening in the mid-18th century that made body snatching kind of more prevalent, that made body snatching really a kind of late 18th century, early 19th century concern, or Georgian, we can say, concern. So we have to go back to prior to the mid-18th century and the worshipful company of Barbers Surgeons. So for quite some time, Barbers and Surgeons had been had shared a common professional guild or worshipful company. I did do this tangent this morning, so I will do it again, of why barbers and surgeons are connected to each other, and it's all to do with the needs of monks. So when you have monks in a monastery, they would hire barbers to prepare their tonsures, which took an awful lot of precision, skill, and some quite specific tools. And those precision, skill, manual dexterity, and those specific tools are also useful for carrying out minor surgeries. And obviously, it's helpful if you're a monk and just employ one man to shave your head and lance a boil too. And so that really fostered this connection of barbers and surgeons. There were other types of doctors, though. That was a particular type of surgeon, one that had studied anatomy and learnt his trade through practical demonstration and apprenticeship. Doctors who had gone down a more academic route and had learned through kind of book learning and studying were known as physicians and were separate to surgeons up until the mid-18th century. However, 1745, the Barbers and Surgeons parted company. I'm not going to do that tangent about why. Oops, sorry, I jumped ahead there. The Barbers and Surgeons separated, leaving surgeons kind of in between two places. So they weren't barber surgeons anymore, but they weren't physicians either. And so there was a real push at that point when the company separated to kind of formalize the teaching of surgery, to make surgeon a recognized profession that had that type of professional formal learning about it. So this is when we see the College of Surgeons emerge and kind of try and regulate the teaching of surgery, and particularly anatomy. So surgeons still studied with apprenticeship and learning from other surgeons. However, they were expected to gain education in a practical study of anatomy. And again, this point, practical study of anatomy meant the dissection of the human body and the study of specimens of the human body that had been dissected. So what happened is, in the seats of medical learning, so really London, Edinburgh and Glasgow on the whole, though some other places as well, you would get wannabe surgeons, so young men who wanted to train as surgeons, flocking there to learn from the masters, and to, as well as all their other learning, they needed to get these practical demonstrations of anatomy. So in London in the mid-18th century, there was an absolute explosion in the teaching of surgery by surgeon anatomists. So people who they were quite entrepreneurial. So while some of them might have been attached to the College of Surgeons, actually the College of Surgeons regulated teaching quite firmly. So quite a lot of them would set up almost in private practice, hiring rooms, using hospital rooms, setting up courses that may or may not be connected to university teaching as well, and opening them up both to medical students and actually the general public a lot of the time as well. And Simon Chaplin has estimated that between 1750 and 1815, over 10,000 young men signed up as hospital pupils. And it's likely that many more attended extramural lectures. And I've seen adverts for these extramural lectures. The anatomist John Sheldon advertised one just to anyone who was interested in seeing a body being cut up. He didn't quite word it like that, but they were pretty blunt in that you didn't have to actually want to be a doctor to go to these talks. So if you wanted to be a doctor, though, particularly if you wanted to be a surgeon, and you were going down that more apprenticeship route or tutelage under an existing surgeon, rather than looking for the academic qualification of physician, you had to go to one of these hospitals and you had to look at one of the dissections. Might be the dissection of a cadaver. There were also dissections of individual organs, limbs, particular parts of the body. Some anatomists like William Hunter would also run classes on making your own specimens. So how to cut tissue so fine that you could make a slide with it. The best way to create a wet preparation, which is your kind of body parts in jars type preparation. He would run classes on that because he and the other teaching anatomists were really insistent that to be a surgeon, you had to build up your own collection of body parts as well. That should give you a hint. That's a lot of bodies needed in what I've just described. And this takes us into the old body snatching days. And it really is that kind of the changes to the way that physicians, surgeons, barber surgeons were all operating, the huge growth in the number of men who wanted to get medical qualifications, hugely popular in the sort of second half of the 18th century, led us into the old body snatching days. So we start in 1745 with the separation of the barbers and surgeons. I've put the Tyburn riot here as a key date as well. So at that point, a really common practice was to take the bodies of executed criminals, particularly executed murderers, from the gibbet, from the gallows, and them to be conveyed away by the beadles straight away to get them as fresh as possible into the anatomy halls or the private rooms of the dissectionist. Now, families weren't happy about that. And so in 1749, and at other times as well, but Tyburn is the kind of famous one. At Tyburn, place of execution, a place of public execution, I should say, families and loved ones of the executed criminals rioted, attacking the beadles and trying to tear their loved ones' bodies down from the gallows so they could transport them away and bury them elsewhere. Riots like this led to the kind of codification of the practice, if you like. 1751, the Murder Act, which is quite a dramatic explanation of why this type of dissection was being allowed. Because the 1751 Murder Act states that the dissection was part of the punishment for murder. So executed murderers could not be buried. They had to be publicly dissected because that was part of the shame of the punishment. So it was that dissection was almost a worse punishment than execution, or an added punishment to execution. But this meant that the anatomists had their pick of all of the executed murderers. However, either the Murder Act was a really good deterrent against murder, or maybe people don't murder that much anyway, but that executed murderers did not fulfill the needs of the anatomist. That was not enough bodies. So you get then employing things like the resurrection men, you get the grave robbing, you get the taking bodies from poorhouses and asylums, and the people that society won't miss. And then in 1828, the dramatic reveal of the Burke and Hare murders, where they chose to just cut out the middleman and just do murders to supply it as well. We also have around this time the cholera riots, which are connected to, not always explicitly when people write about them, but they are very, very seriously connected with body snatching. So the cholera riots broke out in a number of places around the country during the epidemics of cholera, 1830 to 32. And part of it was a mistrust in the medical authorities by people living in poor and very poor conditions in industrialized areas, so living in what we call slums, that not enough was being done to kind of restrict the impact of cholera. But there was also a genuine fear and anxiety around what would happen to poor victims of cholera, particularly if they died in places like poorhouses, workhouses, etc. And so there was a genuine concern, you may call it like a conspiracy theory or a panic that was going on, that if you died of cholera, the anatomists would get you and your body would be taken, whatever your family wanted. This is partly kind of being fueled by the fact that there were mass funerals, hurried funerals, etc., etc., the things that you see during an epidemic. Now, I don't know if you know, but when there's an epidemic or a pandemic on, panic and conspiracy theories spread. I don't know if you've come across that. So in one case, for example, which happened in a slum in Manchester, in the biggest kind of most densely populated slum in Manchester, actually kind of validated those conspiracy theories. A young boy died of cholera and his body was being taken for a funeral. His body was being taken to be buried. And as the coffin was being moved, his grandfather noticed something wrong with it, and he opened it and discovered that the boy had been decapitated. His head was missing and had been replaced with bricks. The head was eventually discovered in the chambers of a medical student who had bribed a nurse at the cholera hospital to let him mutilate the body so that he had the head for dissection later. This led to an outbreak of violence in Angel Meadow as a result. It also led to some changes in burial practice that we don't really have time to go into too much. As a result of the panic around the Burke and Hare murders, a parliamentary select committee that sat and heard from people on various sides of the debate, and the cholera riots as well, the Anatomy Act was passed in 1832, which was deliberately designed to curtail the more nefarious aspects of body snatching, whilst also ensuring a supply of legally endorsed cadavers to anatomists. And it probably worked. It was probably a successful act, because this is the end of the old body snatching days. And while there are a few cases of resurrection men being arrested in the 1840s and even 1850s, there's hardly any. And the idea of body snatching kind of receded from the mind. In the 1840s, it became a plot point in a penny dreadful, but it ceased to be a fear that people had on a day-to-day basis. But just to give you an example of the old body snatching days, I'm going to show you the epitaph on a grave of a teenager who died in 1829. So this grave still exists. You can visit it. You can read this epitaph that was carved into the grave of Lewis Brierley. Though once beneath the ground his corpse was laid, for use of surgeons it was thence conveyed. Vain was the scheme to hide the impious theft, the body taken, shroud and coffin left. Ye wretches who pursue this barbarous trade, your corpses in turn may be conveyed, like his, to some unfeeling surgeon's room, nor can they justly meet a better doom. So this is an empty grave. It's an empty grave where the teenager's body was dug up. Resurrection men have been, well, the implication here is that resurrection men have been employed because once beneath the ground his corpse was laid, but then the surgeons came, or the surgeons' men came and took it, and it's described as a barbarous trade. Now, the reason why this grave interests me is that while I think in the popular imagination, we really localise the idea of body snatching to London and Edinburgh, so that is always where you will see it if it appears in kind of pop culture, and that those were the seats of medical learning. So that's where we assume those anatomy halls and anatomy demonstrations were going on. Lewis Briley's grave is in Mottram in Longdendale, which is just outside Greater Manchester. There were some other examples from around that sort of side, going from the kind of Peak District round to Oldham, really. So we see a couple, like in Staley Bridge, for instance. There's a grave that's sort of carved, this grave not to be reopened at the bottom of the gravestone. I don't know whether or not anyone paid any attention to that warning. I mean, they've never paid attention to those warnings in Egypt, have they? I'm pretty sure Tutankhamun's tomb said that. There was also some records of a gang of resurrection men operating, again, around the Staley Bridge area in a policeman had kept a diary. And so we've got those evidence too. So this really shows us that this terror of the barbarous trade is not limited to London and Edinburgh, capital of England, capital of Scotland, and the seats of medical learning in Britain. It was also around Manchester. And so it's time to turn our attention a little bit to the city of Manchester. Now, I did promise that you don't need to be from Manchester to understand this bit. So as a Mancunian myself, I feel like I should give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the characteristics of our city. I don't want to go on about it for too long, so I'm just going to focus on one in particular, which is overwhelming arrogance. There is a kind of catchphrase for the city that was a quote from Tony Wilson, who founded Factory Records. This is Manchester. We do things differently here. I hear Mancunians use that almost every day. It's like a chant that we use. We love things like this. Manchester named third best city in the world, except we then argue with it, saying, no, we're actually better than San Francisco and Amsterdam. We're the first best city in the world. This arrogance also goes hand in hand with sort of almost overarching ambition, so this picture that illustrates it, it's got some nice skyscrapers on it, or not nice skyscrapers, depending. And you can actually see it's almost like a stepped effect, because the buildings are in the foreground are older and they get newer as they go back, and you can see them get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, the reason why this is relevant is because this is a characteristic that goes back several hundred years in Manchester. So Manchester being arrogant and kind of punching above its weight goes back essentially to, I'd say, the 17th century, but we're going to look at the 18th century. So Daniel Defoe, in his guise as a travel writer, visited the northwest of England in the 1720s and visited Manchester in the 1720s, and he pointed out a number of things about Manchester. Firstly, that it had no MP. And I don't mean it didn't have universal suffrage or it was a rotten borough. It had no MP. It returned no MP to Parliament. It had no corporations, so it had no sort of internal local governance either. It had no borough charter, so it wasn't able to form a town council of its own. It had no cathedral. It was not a city. It was not a city. That by any definition there, it was not a city, and it didn't have city status. In fact, Daniel Defoe went so far as to say that actually Manchester barely qualifies as a town. And he called it a mere village. Now, as a Mancunian, you might start thinking, how dare you call us a mere village? But I will point you to what Daniel Defoe said next. Manchester was indeed a mere village, but it was the greatest mere village in England. And I feel like that is the kind of attitude that characterizes some of the 18th century stuff I want to turn to kind of end this talk, but possibly also 21st century Manchester as well. So Manchester had some things that a village or a small town, which is what it technically should have been, shouldn't have. So it had a collegiate church. The collegiate church went on to become Manchester Cathedral, and it's still known by some as the collegiate church. It shouldn't have had a collegiate church, and it certainly shouldn't have had a collegiate church going back to the time of Elizabeth I. Manchester was divided into several parishes, which as a village or a small town, it really shouldn't have been. It should have been one parish. And very importantly, it had a much larger than expected population. So what Manchester was doing there was behaving like a large town on the route to city status when it had no right to. And that really kind of characterizes the development of certain things in Manchester and kind of characterizes our attitude to things. If there are any Mancunians tonight, I have to break it to you that Daniel Defoe, in the same piece of writing, called Liverpool one of the wonders of the modern world. It wasn't the best village, that's all I'm saying. So let's just turn our attention then to come to the end of this talk to 18th century Manchester, and this will return us then to Cheetham and Cheatwood, which was right on the edge of 18th century Manchester. So as I've said, 18th century Manchester had no political representation, no local council, no MP. It also had no local aristocracy. And what I mean by that is that on the whole, land was owned by the top of the landed gentry. Occasionally might have earls who were more sort of aristocratic earls, but there weren't dukes. This wasn't a place like, for example, Sheffield, where large parts of the land were owned by dukes. Now, this lack of political representation, lack of local aristocracy, gave a huge amount of freedom to the, and I'll use this term really broadly, to the middle classes, because the gentry in Manchester had a huge amount of free rein to buy, sell land, build things, invest in things, etc. But also you kind of educated middle class, like solicitors, for example. It was solicitors that eventually founded Manchester Council, Manchester Town Council. So that kind of the legal profession had a huge amount of power, as did the medical profession as well. And it had this sort of social mobility, but just within the middle class. So it was quite easy to become quite rich if you were entrepreneurial or kind of got in on the action of certain trends. There was no university. That's not too weird in 18th century Manchester. There was no university in London either. Actually, Manchester was pretty much at pace with London in the campaign to get a university. So a lot of the stuff that London was doing as it was kind of moving towards, well, King's and UCL, and they can fight it out themselves as to which was the first university in London. But to get a secular university, Manchester was doing a similar sort of campaigning, which you've got to admit, that is arrogant. Daniel Defoe's just called you a village. So you say, well, if London's getting a university, we're getting one too. But Manchester had no higher education at all. So they had Manchester Grammar School, which was opened in the 16th century. And that's where you went for your grammar school education. But once you'd finished grammar school, if you wanted to continue in any sort of education, you had to leave. So you had the Oxford and Cambridge, and then later Durham, that were Anglican education, and that were colleges of divinity. And then if you wanted to learn something like, for example, medicine, you would go more likely to the Scottish universities, which were based on a somewhat different system. And both London and Manchester when they were arguing for a university in the 18th and into the 19th century, they were arguing for something along the lines of the Scottish universities, not something like Oxford, Cambridge, and Durham. So what Manchester did have was a massively increasing population, and Manchester's population increased a lot in the 18th century. The really sharp increase was in the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, but in the 18th century, it really was increasing, not just in the size of the population, but in certain areas, the density of the population, which would lead to what in the 19th century we would call the industrial slums. Part of the reason for that is the Enclosure Act, switching the whole country from subsistence farming to agricultural labouring, which was very poorly paid, difficult, uncertain existence for people. Manchester offered an alternative in the kind of incipient industry that was going on in the city. So you could give up agricultural labourer in the areas surrounding Manchester and travel into Manchester to get a job, for example, in a dye works or a fustian mill. This created wealth and class divisions because that incipient industrialisation meant that some people could get really rich, like, for example, Humphrey Cheetham, who started off as kind of solidly middle class. And yes, that is the same Cheetham as where the Ghastly find was, but we haven't got time to talk too much about Humphrey today, sadly. But when Humphrey Cheetham died, he had enough, he left the equivalent of £1.5 million in today's money to form Cheetham's Library, which was the first public library in the English-speaking world. It's still there, it's awesome, you should go. But that, yeah, he could just leave 1.5 million for a library, and that's not thinking about any of his other legacies or wealth. So you could get really, really rich without being a duke. You could also get really, really poor, like, for example, the inhabitants of Angel Meadow, who all got killed by cholera and then had their grandsons' heads stolen by medical students. So that we do tend to think about that class division as being a 19th century problem in Manchester, but all I'm suggesting is the 18th century really is when we start to see it. What you see, though, in the 18th century is newly created fashionable and wealthy areas like King Street in Manchester, which is still relatively fashionable today. There's some nice places for tapas and cocktails if you want to go there. In the 18th century, it was where the kind of top end of middle class, gentry but educated gentry might live. It was the home of people who were friends with the barons of Manchester. It was where doctors lived as well. And it was very, very fashionable. And it was near St Anne's Square, which was deliberately built to look like the squares in London and Bath in the 1740s. Manchester has always been arrogant. Oh yeah, we'll just make our town centre look like Bath. So St Anne's Square was laid out to look like that. King Street is nearby. And that's where the fashionable people went. Sorry. So those fashionable, I keep jumping ahead. Those fashionable people who lived in wealthy areas like King Street tried to do something about these gaps that you can see above that bullet point, particularly gaps in education. They felt that somewhere as amazing as Manchester, the greatest village in England, needed to have a more expanded educational offer. So in the second half of the 18th century, a number of educational institutions were founded that did have a huge impact on what would come next in Manchester. So in 1783, the College of the Arts and Sciences was founded, and this is very much the precursor to the University of Manchester. It's pretty much forgotten about now. It's really not that well known. College of the Arts and Sciences was founded by a group of men, mostly working in industry, and the idea was it would provide academic lessons, academic higher education to these sons of industry through a series of lectures on subjects like botany, philosophy, a little bit of divinity, literature, but but also anatomy and medicine and biology as well. It was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating program they did. They also put on lectures for women, and a couple of them that were actually mixed gender allowed. The lectures for women were in the evenings. It worked slightly differently, but they had classes for women as well. The College of the Arts and Sciences kind of didn't last very long. I think it managed about 9 years before it just struggled to carry on, and then it would be a few decades before talk came back round again to forming a university, and then it was the 1850s when the legacy of John Owens allowed the formation of Owens College, which became the University of Manchester. Owens College, though, was run or had similar principles and ideals to the College of the Arts and Sciences. So we can see this one very much as ahead of its time. Now, a couple of years before the College of the Arts and Sciences was founded, the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society was founded as part of a little group of lit and phil societies that were founded in industrial urban areas, or industrialising, in the process of being industrialised urban areas. Manchester Lit and Phil still survives today, still going strong. It is now the second oldest surviving learned society in England. It was hugely influential because everyone who was anyone in anything to do with anything intelligent in Manchester had some connection to the Lit and Phil. So the College of the Arts and Sciences and the Lit and Phil were really, really hand in hand. There's one other development as well that kind of spurred on. It was spurred on by Manchester's increasing population, but it spurred on Manchester's introduction to the world of medical teaching, which was the foundation of Manchester Infirmary, the third infirmary outside of St Bartholomew's or Bart's in London, which is an older institution. The voluntary hospitals that were founded in provincial areas, so areas outside London, and were responding to increasing urban populations. So the first one, I think, was Edinburgh, then it was Bristol, then it was Manchester. Again, punching above its weight. Manchester Infirmary actually was originally in a house and could house 9 patients. It still exists today. It's the Manchester Royal Infirmary. It's huge and is a massive teaching hospital as well. Now, these 3 things, the College of the Arts and Sciences, the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, and the Manchester Infirmary, all had a member/founder in common. And would you believe it? It's Dr. Charles White, the man who had previously been evoked as a figure of the old body-snatching days. White was a founder of Manchester Infirmary, one of several founders, but he was a key figure in the foundation of the infirmary because he was very charismatic and he was very good at raising donations. He also was a member of the Lit and Phil, and he was also a key part of the College of the Arts and Sciences and a firm believer in the College of the Arts and Sciences. Now, I've got a little bit over time, so I'm going to rush through Charles White and then take us back to Cheatwood to finish off. So Charles White, born in 1728, so born into a mere village. He was the son of a Manchester doctor. His father was actually an educated physician, a qualified physician who practiced medicine in Manchester. Charles went away to study in London under William Hunter, brother of John Hunter, and then in Edinburgh, which was standard. But then he returned to Manchester to complete an apprenticeship under the tutelage of his father. Charles White actually became qualified as a surgeon rather than a physician, although him and his father did exactly the same medical practice, which I think is quite revealing of the almost arbitrary distinction between those 2 titles at the time. They worked as surgeons and man midwives, and Charles White's work on obstetrics and midwifery it was hugely influential, very, very important. And he actually went on to found the Lying In Hospital, now St Mary's Hospital, Maternity Hospital in Manchester, which was founded in 1790. Charles White's biggest input into obstetrics was his work on puerperal or childbed fever, which near enough single-handedly eradicated at Manchester Infirmary. He prided himself on that he'd never lost a mother to childbed fever. Mostly because he told people to wash their hands, but it needed to be said, and he said it. He practiced in King Street. The family had a house in King Street. His father had practiced there. He practiced in King Street. And he offered anatomy teaching from his premises in King Street. Obviously, it wouldn't be the huge anatomy theatres of popular culture, but he offered practical anatomy lectures. And some of that would be dissections, and some of that would be based on preparation specimens that he had got from previous dissections. Later on, he offered anatomy teaching from the Lying In Hospital as well. On the whole, these were private lessons rather than public lectures in the case of Charles White. But it wasn't necessarily just for medical students. It was also for people who had kind of interested parties, if you like. He brought in guest speakers because he was absolutely determined that provincial education was going to rival that of the capitals, London and Edinburgh. The whole thing about the College of the Arts and Sciences was to start creating university-style education, higher education. So in order to make sure that Manchester had the sort of medical training that you would get in London and Edinburgh, he brought in his old friend who he'd trained with under William Hunter, John Hunter. So he came and did a guest lecture at the Lying In Hospital about anatomy. Charles White established a medical museum, or a cabinet, which was standard practice. William Hunter actually instructed his students to do it. You needed to have your own collection of preparations and specimens, and you needed to be able to share that with other people who were studying and practicing medicine. So that's where you put all your specimens, all your bits of body, all your skeletons. And Charles White had a medical museum at King Street. It wasn't open to the public, but it was open to anyone who was an interested party. So I think if you just rocked up and you looked like the right sort of person and said, I really want to see some bones, he'd let you. Later on, he moved the medical museum to Lying In Hospital as well. There's a whole story behind that I don't have time to tell you today. So that's Charles White. And we need to just finish off by returning to Cheatwood. So Cheatwood, this is very much how it started, how it's going. So Cheatwood, how it started. Cheatwood, how it's going. That's the same side. The Ghastly find story has pretty much dropped out of the kind of popular and cultural imagination in Cheetham, in Manchester, and generally. Most people do not know this story. So for all how cool it was, and how much it looked like something out of a Victorian Gothic novel, and how much ink the local papers and some of the nationals built on it in the 1890s, it became almost immediately forgotten. And the association, so while in the 20th century people loved writing about the Manchester mummy, they almost never mentioned the Ghastly find at Cheetham. And it just fell out of the memory completely. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of suggestions. Why? The first is that the specifics of Charles White's career had faded. So while people knew that he was the man who created the Manchester mummy, they didn't really understand body snatching, anatomy lecturing, what Charles White had done, and how that might lead to a lead box full of human remains. At the same time, the story of Hannah Beswick. Now, Hannah Beswick died in 1758, and her body was eventually buried in 1868, had become by 1890 completely the stuff of legend. So there were ghost stories in Oldham, there were ghost stories in Sale. She lived all over the place, can you not tell? Didn't really, but the ghost story said she did. There was also some urban legends going on. There was some conspiracy theories about fraud to do with her will, but nothing tangible enough to explain this really specific physical find that had happened. And so the association of Hannah Beswick and the Ghastly find also separated. The changes to Cheetham were dramatic. Showing you Liasson's Wholesalers gives you a little flavour of it as well. But at the time that Cheatwood Hall was being pulled down, the papers described the changes that were going on to Cheetham and Cheatwood, as vandalism, as devastation. The area was completely unrecognisable now. So it's very difficult to have a sense of a past that goes back to prior to 1890. Body snatching was no longer a threat or massively of interest in 1890 either. It was the stuff of fiction. Formal medical education had begun in Manchester in 1814. Owens College opened in 1851. So all that stuff about the old body snatching days, people knew less about it. It had passed out of memory. And Manchester had begun this process of reimagining itself as a 19th century city, which it still does today. We call Manchester Cottonopolis and imagine it as a Victorian city and Victorian alone, which has led to a kind of ignorance about its Georgian past. There's hardly any Georgian architecture remains, and most people couldn't tell you much, for example, about Georgian King Street, meaning that the Ghastly find has got a context that nobody knows and nobody understands. So it ceases to be anything other than a little curiosity. So basically, there's been a sort of unspoken let us never speak of this again, which, by the way, is what the police said at the end of their investigations. They didn't even give the human remains to the coroner because it was so weird. They just basically said, oh, yeah, I suppose we'll never know, and disposed of them. There are some questions remaining. Did Charles White engage in body snatching? I think the answer obviously is yes, but it obviously all depends on what sort of body snatching you're talking about. He certainly had cadavers removed from institutions like the asylum, like the infirmary, like workhouses for the purpose of anatomical dissection. And he certainly carried out postmortems as well on people who died in the infirmary. Did he employ resurrection men to go around the countryside digging up recently buried graves? There's no evidence of that whatsoever. Did he ever intercept a funeral like John Hunter did? Again, there's no evidence of that. He was probably engaged in quite vanilla and legal body snatching. What exactly was buried under Cheatwood Hall? Well, it was human remains, obviously. Nobody's found any evidence to say exactly what it was. I think I know, but I'm going to leave that for another time, tantalisingly. But was this something to do with Hannah Beswick, the Manchester mummy? Well, if I tell you that the house in question was actually not Charles White, and Charles White didn't live there, his children inherited it under the terms of Hannah Beswick's will, because Cheatwood Hall was Hannah Beswick's house. It is the house where she died, and quite likely the house where her body was prepared, turned into the Manchester mummy. Ooh, intriguing. What happened to Patience Buckley? Was she really murdered by a butcher from Ashton-under-Lyne? Well, no, but it's quite a fun story, isn't it? And are there more ghastly secrets hiding under the city? Yes, there's loads. Every day when I go to work and I get off the tram, I walk over graves. I walk over the grave of the man who ordered the charge at Peterloo, which is really creepy, when they dug up to build St. Peter's Square tram station. They just dug up a cemetery and disinterred the bodies to have a good look at them and then put them back in and built a tram stop over the top. My local Tesco, which would have been Hannah Beswick's local Tesco if she lived to see Tesco, is built on top of a Methodist graveyard. The graves were dug up, exhumed, the bodies were given to family or buried in mass graves in municipal graveyards, leading to a wonderful headline in the Manchester Evening News: Tesco desecrated my grandfather's grave. All cities have this, though. After I gave the talk this morning, I went on Instagram, just sort of scrolling through it, and there is a reel from the Benjamin Franklin Museum just explaining that when it was, so this is the last surviving residence that was Benjamin Franklin's, it's in London, when they converted it to a museum in the 1990s, they just stumbled upon 1,200 bones in the back garden, because Benjamin Franklin was friends with, you guessed it, an anatomist who had carried out private medical teaching from there. And that was just the leftovers that he buried in the back garden. So all cities have these secrets. I have run slightly over time. If anyone's got any questions, I'd love to hear them. And the Hannah Beswick book is in progress. If you want to find out more from me about any of it, Instagram's Relics and Spectres, Twitter, speaking of relics, is She-Wolf Mank. I'd love to hear from you. Sam, I'm sorry I went over again.